Highlighting 101. In this video, we're going to look at an example of phonemes and allophones from English. Let's start by looking at the first two words from this word list, pin and spin. Both of these words have p sounds, but they are actually not exactly the same sound. To understand this, try saying both words out loud and put your hand in front of your mouth as you say them. Pin, spin. Do you notice how the word pin has an extra puff of air that you don't really get with the word spin? That's because the p sound is aspirated in pin, and this is shown in the IPA with a superscripted H after the P. In the word spin, however, the p sound is unaspirated. The same thing is true for the t sounds in top and stop, and the k sounds in can and scan. The words pin, top, and can all begin with aspirated voiceless stops, but the words spin, stop, and scan all have unaspirated voiceless stops. Now, most English speakers don't even know that these are different sounds unless they study phonetics. We don't really think of these as different sounds the same way that, for example, the p in pin and the b in bin are different sounds. And you could never take an English word that has a voiceless stop and change it to an unaspirated stop and get a completely new word with a different meaning. In other words, in English, the aspirated and unaspirated versions of a voiceless stop are allophones of the same phoneme. Now, in some languages, changing the aspiration of a stop actually does change it to a completely new phoneme. Hindi and Korean are a couple of examples. But English doesn't work that way. So why do we have both aspirated and unaspirated voiceless stops? Well, the aspiration of a stop in English depends on the sounds that come immediately before and after it. So in phonology, whenever you want to figure out patterns that a certain sound is following, you want to start by taking a list of words that are written phonetically, like the one that we have here, and then making lists of all the environments where you find the different sounds. So for example, we're looking at aspirated and unaspirated voiceless stops here. And so we're going to make lists of where we find unaspirated voiceless stops and where we find aspirated voiceless stops. And so if we make a complete list of the environments where we find those two categories of sounds, this is what we will end up with. And we're just going to assume for now that p, t, and k all follow the same rules, since they are all part of the same category of sounds, voiceless stops. Okay, so if we look at the first word, for example, pin, we find an aspirated stop, the aspirated P, at the beginning of a word, followed by the vowel I. So what we do with that is we put that in the list of environments for aspirated stops, and we have a number sign to indicate a word boundary. Then we have an underscore to show that that's where the voiceless stop goes, and then we have the small capital I to show the vowel sound, and that's how we show the environment, the sounds that come immediately before and after that sound. Next, we have the word spin, and so there we have an unaspirated stop, so we're going to put this environment in the list of environments for unaspirated voiceless stops. And so here the environment is we have S before it and then I after it. So we're going to write the letter S, then an underscore, then a small capital I. So we want to do that for every single time that we find any voiceless stop, p, t, or k, either aspirated or unaspirated, anywhere in this word list. So if we do that for every single instance and make a complete list of all the environments, then we will end up with the two lists that are shown here. So once we have a complete list of environments, the next thing that we want to do is examine those lists to look for patterns. So if we look at these lists, what sort of patterns can we notice? Well, one thing that you might notice is that the unaspirated stops often appear after S, and the aspirated stops never come after S. Okay, but that's not always true because at least once we have an unaspirated stop that comes after a vowel. We've got an unaspirated P in top and in stop, which comes after the vowel ah. Okay, so we can't just say that a voiceless stop is unaspirated after an S because that doesn't quite account for all the data. Okay, now what about if we look at the aspirated stops? If you look at all the environments, you'll notice that those always come at the beginning of a word. Remember again that the number sign stands for a word boundary. So we always have a number sign coming before the voiceless stop in the list of environments for aspirated stops. Now let's look at the unaspirated stops to see if those ever come at the beginning of a word. And it turns out that they don't. So it seems like this rule can account for all the data that we have. So now we are ready to write a rule. So we can state the rule this way, that in English, the voiceless stops p, t, and k are aspirated when they come at the beginning of a word, but elsewhere they are unaspirated. And notice that the letters P, T, and K, the IPA symbols for the sounds, are written in slashes rather than brackets. And that's to show that we are talking about phonemes. And each phoneme can have different allophones, which means it's not always the exact same phonetic sound. So we're talking about these three phonemes which have at least two different allophones in English. Now, this rule is actually a little bit more complicated than what we're showing here, but the way that we've stated it here, it does account for all the data that we have looked at so far. So what you always want to do is try to find the simplest possible rule that explains all the data that you have.